Welcome to our second chapter on the cardiovascular system. Earlier, we looked at the blood, and now we are ready to move on to look at the pump that drives the movement of this liquid media in the vasculature. So our topic on this chapter will be the heart. In fact, the reason why I'm particularly excited of this chapter is that much of my research career I spent on working on the cardiac research field. What I am especially interested is the cardiac imaging, in particular with the MRI, and to be more precise, the coronary vessel imaging and the survival prediction based on novel image analysis methods. So this is something that I am very excited to share with you. The heart is really, in my opinion, an amazing organ. It starts to beat very early in the development, about 22 days after fertilization, although it is not seen until later, about 5 weeks after last period. When does the heart stop beating then? Yes, at death. But throughout the entire rest of the time, it never stops to rest, and it beats about 7,000 liters of blood each day, and about 2.5 billion beats throughout a lifetime. Imagine, it never rests throughout that time, always working tirelessly. So, heart is really important to us, and we can see this with some of the terminology too. You can hear jump out of your chest, or you can break your heart. We can have heartache. We wish someone well from the bottom of our heart, or ask someone to have some heart. Doing something immediately happens in a heartbeat. How about my heart goes out for you when something bad has happened? Can you die of a broken heart? See, there are many examples. So clearly for a long time we have known that heart is important. To even such a point that back in the day it was thought that your soul was located in your heart. We still hear someone making references to have nothing but good intentions in their heart. What is interesting is that the cardiovascular systems are not alike from one animal to another. Here we can see, for example, cardiovascular system of a fish, amphibian, reptile, and mammal. The number of chambers in the heart and the complexity of the circulations varies, as we can see. But we will be focusing on a human cardiovascular system. We notice that these are closed loop and one-way system. For example, Madagascar hissing cockroaches, which I keep at my lab for some of the experiments that we do in my biology classes, they have a very different cardiovascular system. It's an open loop, multiple chambers of a heart, and a rather lymph that is circulated into empty spaces instead of vessels. But as I said, our focus will be the humans. So let's look at the human cardiovascular system as a whole really quickly. So first of all, we see that we have a heart, and we have two types of blood flowing in the system. The blood returning to the heart from the most of the body is deoxygenated, lacking oxygen and shown in blue color. While the blood leaving the heart to the body is oxygenated and rich in oxygen and shows in red on this diagram. Let's add a little more to this diagram. Firstly, we have something known as pulmonary circuit. This is where the deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart goes to the lungs to get oxygen and returns back to the heart on the left side, oxygen rich. So that is, if you wish, our first loop in the cardiovascular system. And the second loop is when the blood, which is oxygen rich, leaves the heart from the left side and travels the rest of the body. There it gives the oxygen to the tissues and returns back to the right side of the heart as deoxygenated, oxygen-poor blood. This is systemic circuit. So these are the two loops or circuits of our cardiovascular system. So let's have a look of the heart a little more. It is approximately fist-shaped organ, and this is an easy scale for you to use when you compare babies and adults and want to have a rough scale to look at the differences in the size of their hearts. And here I have added outlines around this previous drawing that we saw. See how most towards us we can see this big muscular wall covering most of the view. Now we have removed the drawing, leaving just outlines, and I did this for a reason. I want to show you how the heart, being a hollow organ, it really has a cone-like shape, like here. The big muscular walls hide inside two cone-shaped chambers, and we will have a closer discussion on those in a minute. What I do want to highlight here is that a lot of the heart is made of this muscular wall. That is what makes it this pump that drives the flow of blood in a cardiovascular system. Let's look at the location of the heart. It is located within the thorax, fairly medially in a space called mediastinum, just between the lungs. And of course, the heart is also located above the diaphragm, between ribs 2 and 5. Notice how the apex of the heart, and this is the most inferior anterior tip, the point of the heart, notice how it is pointing left of the midline, inferiorly and left. And let's return back to having a look of the structures inside the heart. For this, we will return to this picture. It is only slightly enlarged from what we saw earlier on our discussion of the pulmonary and systemic lobes. What we have here are the internal hollow spaces inside the heart. These are the chamber of the heart. And there are 4 of these in total that we need to look at. Let's review those. On the top, so that is the most superior part, the 2 chambers that we have are known as atria. These are chambers where the blood gets collected to and builds up. So we have one on the right and one on the left side of the heart. And we also have ventricles. These are much more inferior and larger in size, and they are where we have these powerful muscular walls that I mentioned earlier. So they pump the blood out from the heart. And again, we have one on both right and left side. Let's go back to this view. And what I want to discuss with you next and show with this figure is that the heart is located in the mediastinum, inside a sac. This is our pericardium. And we will look at pericardium in a little bit more detail. I do want to mention the terminology that the term myocardium instead refers to the cardiac muscle wall and was a significant focus of my research career. But back to the pericardium. So here we see enlarged view of the heart wall and this pericardial structure. So we can see the heart wall, which has its many components. And then notice how pericardium is made of 2 layers, parietal, also known as fibrous layer, and visceral layer, which is also known as epicardium. And in between, we have the pericardial cavity, which is filled with a fluid that lubricates these 2 layers as they slide across each other. That is what allows the heart to move so effortlessly, contracting and expanding, although it is located in the small space in between the lungs. And this brings me to talk about one clinical condition that is important to note: pericarditis. So those of you who have already taken their medical terminology classes remember that itis was an inflammation of something. And in this case, it's going to be an inflammation of the pericardial cavity. So let's talk more about it. Pericarditis is a condition that we would hear with a stethoscope. It sounds like this cracking sound as the rough membrane surfaces rub against each other. I want to go back to this diagram just briefly, just to highlight the different layers of the heart now that we have dealt with the pericardium. Epicardium is the outermost, myocardium the thick, fleshy middle part, and endocardium the innermost layer of the heart. Okay, and this is just a reminder. Remember that there were 3 general muscle tissue types. And it is the cardiac muscle that we are especially interested here. Remember this muscle type where the cells were branching and connecting to other cardiac muscle cells through intercalated discs in order to synchronize the contractions. And these had one central nucleus per cell and also had striations. So I want to mention a few further details that are characteristic for cardiac muscle cells. First, there is going to be a lot of mitochondria in these cardiac muscle cells. These cells were highly active. Remember how we spoke at the beginning of the video about the heart never being at rest. So these muscle cells need a lot of energy. Another important characteristic was, as I mentioned already earlier, the intercalated discs at the ends of these branching cardiac muscle cells were connected to their other peers. This was important as we want cells that make a heart muscle mass at one area to contract simultaneously. Note that the heart muscle is independent and not under voluntary control, so you do not need to think about, now I'm going to have my heart contracting. Instead, this self-excitable character of the heart is controlled by pacemaker cells, which then oversee the contracting cells. Also note that the heart muscle of one area contracts as one unit. And there are a lot of chemical messengers and information that we can detect about the heart state from the blood. So, for example, in case of a cardiac infarction. Finally, if you think back of our action potential in a nervous cell, you will see that in case of cardiac muscle cells, there is a longer recovery time in order to allow a heart chamber to fill. One last thing, heart only uses aerobic respiration. While you might remember from skeletal muscles that sometimes we could resort to anaerobic respiration, which resulted in the buildup of lactic acid. In aerobic respiration of the heart, a lack of oxygen would be very much of a problem. But that's enough of these extra details of the heart. Let's return back to this diagram that we saw earlier. And we remember that there were 4 chambers that we need to know. These were right atrium, right ventricle, and then left atria and left ventricle. If you want to simplify things, you could even draw a heart like this. The key thing here is the 4 chambers and their locations. And we could, I guess, add the flow of the blood into this diagram too. First, to the right atrium from the rest of the body. Then, to the right ventricle. From here, the blood gets pumped to the lungs. And then, blood comes back from the lungs to the left atrium, from where it gets pumped to the left ventricle and further back to the rest of the body. So knowing the chambers and what goes where is going to be important for us. Let's go back to this diagram. A couple of things that I want to say here. Notice that the atria are the most superficial chambers. These are the chambers that receive blood, and it be from the systemic circulation or pulmonary circulation. Kind of like a collecting sites. An important structure of them that results from this role of theirs and that I want to highlight is these auricles. They increase the volume of the atria by being at rest like these flabby expansions of the sacs, but having the capacity to expand as the atria fills with blood, providing extra space for the blood to build into. Then we should have a look of the ventricles. They are more inferior and their function is to shoot out the blood from the heart, like we just saw with our box diagram of the heart. So blood leaves from there to the lungs or to the rest of the body. So, the pulmonary or systemic circulation. And the inside walls of these ventricles are lined with tuberculosis coronae. These are irregular ridges that prevent blood from getting stuck somewhere there and clotting inside the heart. And finally, one more structure that I would like to point out here. This wall that separates the two ventricles is known as the septum. Let's return back once again to this initial diagram without extra labels. A few things that I want to highlight here. Let's shift our focus on valves, which allow flow of blood one way, but prevent backwards flow the other way. So these play a key role in ensuring the unidirectional flow of blood in the heart. Firstly, we have two AV valves, which separate the atria and ventricle on each side of the heart. Therefore, they're named accordingly as right and left AV valves. And here, I have added a picture of the heart looking down. We can see all four valves. Let's observe it a little closer as this relates to the AV valves. Something you might find that the right AV valve is also called tricuspid wall. This is because it is made of 3 leaflets, 3 cusps, so tricuspid. And on the left side, the left AV valve is sometimes called bicuspid valve. For the same reason, there are 2 cusps on this valve. Another name that is sometimes used is the mitral valve, just so that you are aware of all these names. So that's our AV valves. Now I want us to look at our 2 valves that separate the ventricles from the vessels where they pump blood to. And these would be pumping blood to the lungs via pulmonary trunk on the right side, so this would be called pulmonary valve. And on the left side, the valve that separates left ventricle from the aorta would be called aortic valve. Interestingly, just like AV valves had, these valves have a common name. They are known as semilunar valves, semi referring to the partial and lunar to the moon, so they look like half moons when it comes to their leaflets. So there we have our 4 valves. Note that there is no need for valves where the vessels enter the atria on either side. And while we are talking about valves, I want to mention some clinical relevance. So we can have issues with the valve having failed and resulting in a black flow. In this case, the heart is not achieving its function of pumping blood in a one-way manner, but ends up repumping the same blood back and forth. This is not effective. Or we can have valve that has narrowed. So here we have insufficient opening of the valve. And as a result, in this case, the heart needs to contract more forcefully to pass enough blood. So that would not be great either. How do you treat this? Well, you could replace the valve either by mechanical, animal, or cadaveric originating replacement wall. And while we discuss the path of blood in another video, there is something that I do want to point out from this diagram that we saw earlier. When we compare the pulmonary and systemic circulations, there is a lower pressure in the pulmonary valve. This is because there is a lesser distance to travel, and we do not want to burst the vessels at the lungs by forcing blood too forcefully to this shorter loop. While systemic circulation has a longer distance to cover, essentially all rest of the body. So there is a higher pressure there to start with. Arteries, which we will look at the next chapter, are thick and elastic and can't handle this, and even have some muscle in the wall to regulate the blood pressure. And then we have veins after the pressure has dropped and they are thin from their walls. Finally, before we wrap up this video, I want to talk a little bit about the surface anatomy of the heart and coronary circulation. So let's start with the surface anatomy. I will highlight only a few features. So we have various sulci that we want to notice. And from our discussion of the topography of the brain, you remember that this term referred to grooves, and these are important anatomical landmarks when we look at the surface of the heart. So let's see them in a picture. So the atrio-ventricular groove, the depression that separates the atria and ventricle, is our first one. Here it runs the coronary arteries, so it's named coronary sulcus. Next, we have a depression that separates the ventricles on the anterior side. This is known as anterior interventricular sulcus. And finally, we have one on the posterior side separating again the ventricles. This is, not surprisingly, posterior interventricular sulcus. So those are the important sulci to know. Finally, I said that I want to still talk about the coronary circulation. So if the heart is constantly at work, where does it get the energy and nutrients that the cardiac muscle cells need for their tireless work? Yes, it must have its own supply of blood vessels. And this is what much of my research focused on the three main vessels and how they supply different regions of myocardium, and how we can see that in the living and in patients with myocardial injury. What you're seeing here are the blood vessels of the human heart. And we will be focusing on arteries. In fact, these coronary arteries are the first arteries that arise right after the aortic valve. And this is in response to the fact that 1/20th of the body's blood supply goes to the heart. And rather interestingly, this functional blood supply to the heart itself is the shortest circulation in the body. And it is delivered when the heart is relaxed. And it is the left ventricle that receives most of the coronary supply. This circulation ensures that the nutrients and oxygen are brought to the cardiac muscle and that the carbon dioxide and waste products are taken away. In most people, there is a left dominance of these arteries which wrap around the heart. However, it is possible that there are different kinds of bypasses if needed. Let's have a look at the three important coronary arteries. First, left coronary artery. It arises from the aorta, arching clockwise to the anterior side, where it then divides into left anterior descending artery, which runs in the interventricular groove towards the apex of the heart. And then the second branch, left circumflex artery, follows the line between left atria and ventricle, arching to the posterior side of the heart. Right coronary arteries arise instead on the opposite side of the aorta, running in the groove between right atria and ventricle, arching to the posterior side. And there are a number of coronary veins, but I will leave those for you to study independently. So that's it for this video, which covered quite a bit. I hope you found it useful.